the topic for this session is how to graduate more students with less debt and more skills. And the thesis I want to put in front of you before I introduce our panel is that is at the center of many of our most important conversations in education and workforce development right now. So we'll start with the obvious one, debt. There is a conversation you might have heard about student debt, current state, existing past debt, future debt. And so that's part of the conversation today. Secondly, there's a conversation about the value of higher education. So there's some polls that might suggest that students and families are starting to question that more than they have in the past. There's some other polls that maybe are a little less conclusive on that, but it is certainly out there that there are more questions than there used to be about the value of post-secondary education. And we don't have to just look at polls, we can actually look at data. So if you look at the State Opportunity Index that Strata just came out with and the data that's cited in that, it would suggest that there is on average a positive return on investment for post-secondary education, but that's not universal. And that data would say, you know, depending on the type of program, depending on the state, 60 to 80% of students are seeing a positive return on investment from their higher education. Now we can dig into the numbers, but all that to say on average positive, but quite variable at the individual level. And so that's part of the conversation today. My team, we work on education and workforce, and so I don't think this conversation is complete without talking about a couple of additional issues. When you go to the workforce side, there is an imperative for more graduates with more of the right skills. I don't know, maybe some of you read the Wall Street Journal article last week about chips and about the workforce shortages and the workforce needs related to the semiconductor industry. That's just one example. But there's a workforce imperative for more graduates with more of the right skills. And lastly, as we think big picture and forward looking, but inclusive of right now, you know, there's some big forces out there. You might have heard, if you've been around here, living in the past year, something about AI. We're thinking a lot about how AI is going to influence our economies, influence our workforce. Also, climate. There is some form of a green transition that's happening, and one of the questions in the climate world, we talk about a just transition. I think that applies to AI too. There's a question about, well, as these shifts happen in our economies and in our workforces, will there be opportunity for some or will there be opportunity for all? And so that also is a conversation about more graduates with the right skills. So we have 36 minutes and 59 seconds to solve all of this. But you have just the right panel to do it, because in order to make progress in all of these areas in the domain of more graduates, more of the right skills, less debt, we need innovation. We need some new approaches. We need some new approaches when it comes to policy, when it comes to strategy, and when it comes to good old-fashioned execution, when it comes to trying things and seeing what works and what doesn't. And we have some of all of that on this panel. So first, I will do the rundown. I think I remember everybody's titles, but I'm going to pull out my paper here just to make sure. Okay, so starting from here and going down, we have Sarah Leone, the CEO and founder of Ziplines Education. We have Dan Fisher, the president and CEO of ECMC Group. We have Naveen Megahead, president of National Louis University. We have Jordy Hyland, president and CEO of American College of Education. And then we have Steve Taylor. Yours is the one I did have to write down. Director and Senior Fellow, Education and Workforce with the Stand Together Trust. So great panel and lots to learn and lots to cover. So Naveen, I want to start with you. When we had our conversation amongst this group a couple weeks ago, one of the things you started with, and I think it's a great place to start with here, is let's reframe the conversation from one about debt or just about debt to one about return on investment. I think there's maybe some self-evident reasons why that might be a good idea, but I'd love for you to start us out there. Why is that important?
Sure, thanks. So, when you look at sort of net present day value of education versus what it was, say, in the 60s, education has gotten more expensive, but it's gone up 4x as opposed to things like housing that have gone up 10x. So the cost of education is something we need to pay attention to, but we're a very diverse sector, and people can get an education very inexpensively, or they can spend a whole lot of money to get an education. There's room to find the right price point that you can afford. The issue isn't whether you can access it. The issue is when you get there, do you complete it? That's where the debt issue becomes an issue. We have a huge proportion of students that do not complete their education. Of course, diverse learners and students of color have even more of a percentage of not completing their education. And that's where you end up not looking at the benefit of education, nor do you get an ROI on education. So I think we need to change that conversation to what is the ROI, and how do we get students to complete, and how do we ensure that they then transition to career. I think higher ed has to own the education all the way to the employment cycle, and I think they have to think about, is there interim employment steps along the way, because so many of our learners today have economic and housing insecurity, and they need to solve those issues much faster than they do in a 4-year trajectory.
Jordy. Yes.
So I think that's a very valuable perspective, and I just wanted to provide some thoughts on, I think, a complementary but alternate perspective in terms of the debt. I do think, so you mentioned some of the surveys that have been out there, and some that I've seen, about 50% of people question the value of higher education, and I do think that that is very tied to the student debt levels. And when you look at the average debt for a bachelor's, it's about $37,000. For a master's, $83,000. For a PhD, about $125,000. And I think that's playing into the people's psyches and their concern about higher ed. And the typical graduate takes about 10 to 30 years to pay off the debt, and that can impact many life decisions, whether to have kids, whether to make other major financial decisions like getting on the housing ladder. So certainly appreciate the perspective about the need to focus on ROI and getting higher ed working more closely with employers. But I do think the debt levels for many that potentially don't have the the financial expertise or the information from the institutions to make good decisions are getting into the debt. So did want to just bring that into the discussion.
So maybe to pick up on the last part of that around information for students. So it's one thing for policymakers and for us to have a sort of high-level conversation about ROI. I know, Jordy, your institution, you've done an ROI study. Yep. But what about engaging with students on that? And so maybe, Sarah, I'll start with you on that one. Maybe a little bit of context for the room if anybody isn't familiar with Ziplines, but how you think about through your programs the engagement with the student around the ROI of what they're doing.
Yeah, so a little context. We are not offering 4-year degrees. We're offering short-term, alternative credentials, non-degree, non-credit, and they're really career certificates that we do partner with higher education institutions, and we really target adult learners. So our average age is 35 to 37. They likely have a degree, maybe they don't have a degree, but they're looking to refresh their skill sets so that they can, whether it's take advantage of a promotion in their existing job or reskill into something completely new. And so when we think about return on investment, I will say first and foremost, it starts with our return on investment of, are we building programs that we can sustain, that we know that there's going to be growth from a consumer perspective, there's going to be demand, and there's going to be a capability for us to be able to produce a course that has the right outcomes. And then we really look at, okay, great, so what's the labor market looking for, right? What are the skills that are needed for these folks to be able to successfully transition into whatever that outcome is that they're setting out to accomplish? And then we measure all of it. And so I will say it's easier when it's a 10-week program versus I think sometimes a 4-year degree program or even a 2-year associate's program where we actually capture feedback every week. The students are in our class. Everything is cohort-based. It's paced. We capture feedback at the end of the course, and then we capture it 6 months later. And the idea there is really understanding it within the 10 weeks, what's their satisfaction level, right? Where are they still walking away with questions? Where have they maybe fallen into a challenge? At the end of the course, it's really, are you starting to apply these immediately within, whether it's an interview process or back on the job? And then 6 months later, it's, did this course have the impact that you set out to accomplish? And all of those measurements come back into our learning process so that we're continually optimizing how we think about engagement with our students, engagement with the instructors, and how we pull that all together.
Can you just take that one step deeper on how does it actually happen? Who is engaging? Who is doing it? Or how are you leveraging technology? How are you getting that real-time input from the student?
Yeah, we when we built our platform from the very beginning, we integrated a very simple Net Promoter Score feedback mechanism. And then for those of you not familiar with Net Promoter Score, it's not a measurement of learning outcomes, but it gives us a great feedback loop in terms of student satisfaction. And we asked 2 questions, and the questions, and these are all embedded directly in the asynchronous part of our course. It's hybrid, it's async and sync. And we use the content within there also then to drive what are we bringing into the live sessions. And then we use tools as simple as SurveyMonkey, right? We're not reinventing the wheel in terms of how we're gaining feedback. And in many cases, we're actually sending people a $15 Amazon gift certificate, right? Because it's worth their time and our effort to get that feedback into the process. So is that?
That's great.
Okay.
Yeah. So a couple places I want to go with that. So Naveen, I want to bring the same question to you in just a second in the context of NLU. After that, Dan, I'm going to go to you because there was something that Jordy said around the financial literacy aspect of that, and I know that's something you guys care about. And Steve, I'm coming to you on policy in just a minute. But Naveen, to you, how does it actually work in your institution in terms of engaging with students and, in some cases, families on return on investment before, during, and after their experience with you?
Well, in a number of ways. First of all, we also as an institution have invested in a program called Accelerate U, which is a series of short-term credentials linked up with employers. The credentials are generally shorter than 6 months. They're not 10 weeks, so they're longer than that. And they're tied to finding a job or us putting them into a job when they complete the credential. We've also made that credential stackable so that they can use all the credit they've earned in that credential towards their bachelor's degree when they're ready. And in fact, we're working on designing now what we call Learn and Earn in 3, where we're going to use the work environment where they go into as part of the credit they will earn, while they also take additional courses and demonstrate the additional development of skills to get that bachelor's very quickly. So that's one place where we're looking directly at the economic impact of that job, and the outcomes we're looking at is that they're earning $20,000 more than they were earning before they came in. Then we also have invested heavily in what we call our career bridge, which is for all of our students who are graduating with degrees, where we have a saying at National Louis University that says, if you graduate and you do not have a job, we have failed. Very clearly, there's no question. If you graduate, I don't care about those iPads number, and you are not employed, we as an institution have failed. Because we are serving a lot of first-gen and diverse learners who are coming from backgrounds where they're don't have a lot of resources, nor do they have the networks to transition to employment. And if we do not take on the role of being that network for them and connecting the dots of how their education will link them into employment and help them make that transition to employment, then we're not doing what we're supposed to do in higher ed. We are not achieving the promise. We are not driving the ROI. I think because we've made that commitment so intentionally, For the last 2 years, we were one of the institutions that made it on the Washington Monthly driving social and economic mobility on behalf of our students, which I actually loved because it was like Stanford, Harvard, Yale, National Louis University. Everybody's like going, who's National Louis University? Well, National Louis University is a university who has deliberately committed to driving the economic and social mobility for all of its learners, because we fail if we don't do that.
Thank you. And that is very cool.
Thanks.
I do want to ask the tactical follow-up there. So part of what you just spoke to is the structural aspect, right? Creating stackable credentials is a structural, strategic change to enable different sorts of pathway progressions. What about the interface with students? How is that going? And how do you think about the relationships that students have through advising or other means to enable them to take ownership of their own journey? Where would you say, what's working on that front? What are you thinking about in that area?
So I think, students are, they're each is different, right? So some are immediately raising their hand saying, how do I keep going? Others are like, I'm just going to work for a while. Others are, I think if you offer them the opportunity and really work with them to show them how it's made seamless for them, we'll jump in and say, all right, I'm going to give this a shot and get it done. So I think institutions have to have the flexibility to meet students where they're at. And I think we need to stop thinking of higher ed as we are a degree, creator of degreed outcomes. We should be a lifelong learning partner that creates credentials along the lifespan that helps them to reskill, upskill, and change as they go along. And I think when higher ed flips that model that way, it's going to really start meeting the needs of learners of today.
That's great. So Dan, I want to bring the financial literacy question in. So return on investment, at least in a sort of narrow construct, is a calculation, involves numbers, money. How does financial literacy fit into that? And how do you think about your efforts or those in the field in financial literacy integrating with other aspects of student advising that get into talking about their pathways?
Yeah, thanks for the question and also the panel. I think this is a really important discussion here. One of the things that we started with is, what do students actually tell us? So Sarah's talking about adult learners, and we've been talking about lifelong learners. And some of the research that we've done suggests that 88% of high school students consider post-secondary education for the long-term earning potential. Right, so this is not about getting a degree. This is about improving your lot in life. Whether you're a low-income student, underserved student, first-generation student, that's what we're all here for. And if you can't get excited about that in the morning, you're probably not in this room. But in terms of the financial literacy, one of the things that we've spent a lot of time thinking about and working about, particularly recently, is FAFSA completion. So the FAFSA challenges, and I'll be generous in the characterization, that we've all had over the last year has had a significant decrease in FAFSA completion, 30%, 40%. We need to go the other way. Hopefully, long term, we will go the other way, because what the data tells us is that when students complete the FAFSA, underserved students do better. But it has to be in conjunction with better financial literacy, better opportunities to understand what that FAFSA process is. There are 12 states. Louisiana led the way about 5 or 6 years ago, requiring the FAFSA as a condition of graduation. Think about that. Louisiana led the way. There are 12 states since then that have required. Once Louisiana required that, 80% of their students completed the FAFSA. That had an enormous impact on underserved students in Louisiana. Now, unfortunately, they pivoted, and just this year they are changing their mind and making it to an opt-in as opposed to an opt-out. But nevertheless, 12 states have gone that way since then. And I think as we think about how to energize and engage underserved first-generation students, this is a really important discussion. And so if we're not all talking about how to increase FAFSA completion, that should be in all of our talk tracks now.
So I think that's a good segue to you, Steve. We talked a lot about what might happen within an institution and or a partner with institutions. Dan talked about one policy lever. Broaden the picture. When we think about less debt, more of the right skills, what are some of the top policy levers that you think we should be considering?
Yeah, so I approach the policy space and policy work not as a policymaker, but as an academic at heart. I've spent my career in higher education. I'm an academic, and I'm also increasingly highly skeptical of the value and relevance of higher education and of a college degree. In decades past, a college degree was a lever toward economic mobility, upward mobility, but I think as the costs have risen and we see higher underemployment for college graduates because they're getting jobs where a degree may not necessarily be required, but it's skills, perpetual underemployment is leading to that decreased value and relevance of a degree in a job market where, quite frankly, they're becoming less of a currency. So I think this idea of just getting more students into more degree programs, it's not a full solution. We need to be thinking about broader post-secondary pathways. And so as we think about the policy levers to enable broader post-secondary pathways, not just degrees, it means that we need to open up the type of funding that's available to students to pursue many of these growing alternative pathways. And I say alternative not to demean these pathways, but they're non-college pathways. Merit America, Per Scholas, these are very, very successful programs that are no cost or low cost, quick, 15-week programs, putting people into six-figure jobs within just a couple of years of completing. The problem is far too many students are locked out from pursuing these pathways because they're not Title IV or federal student aid eligible. So what happens in this country is somebody wants to pursue post-secondary education, they graduate high school, and what happens is they're steered into college, whether or not it's the right pathway for them, especially if you're low income and you don't have disposable income. Here's your financial aid package. You can use it at one of the accredited institutions in this country to go get a degree, whether or not a degree is the right pathway for you, which is why we've also seen 40 million Americans start college, not finish. They have some credit, no degree, and a bunch of debt. Imagine if we had policies that said, instead of just going to college, take what financial aid would be available to you and pursue some other non-degree pathway from a provider that partners deeply with employers that can get you a job making a living wage in a short time frame. And so that's what we're working toward, is opening the aperture of what post-secondary means, not just college, making sure that we free up the resources that already exist, Pell Grants, state aid, student loans, but not just to pursue a program, student loans that actually deliver value to a student to pursue a program where they know the job, the earnings that they're going to attain after completing a credential are more valuable than the debt they took on to pursue that credential.
Okay, panel, we can consider this our tour through the policy domain. Anybody want to suggest something to add to or challenge what Steve said?
Well, let me add one point to that. We've spent years talking about the wage premium. And what I think is really interesting is we're starting to talk about the wealth premium, right? So we're not only looking at the value of higher education, but the cost of higher education, right? So many of us went through school so many years ago that, you know, tuition was pretty low, and so the debt loads were pretty low, and now those numbers on both sides of the equation get to be a lot higher. So one thing I'll throw out is the team at the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, they've got some data scientists that are really looking at that wealth premium generated, and the results are exactly what we thought they were. Not all degrees generate the same amount of wealth, particularly when you think of the fact that most students coming out of high school into college are thinking about that long-term potential. So this is where the data matters. Maybe one very specific point, there is a regulation that is recently updated by the Department of Education, is going to take effect soon, that will prohibit Title IV eligible institutions from having policies that dissuade student loan borrowing. So think about everything we've heard about student loan problem, student loan bomb, student loan, cliff, all of this stuff. But now the department is requiring schools to step back from advising students that maybe this isn't enough, maybe this isn't the right number of student loans for you. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed in the community.
And that's a key point right now is schools get a lot of blame for the debt. And yes, costs have risen. Schools are not allowed to count. It is illegal for schools to counsel students against borrowing the maximum that they're allowed to borrow. So federal lawmakers in DC are paying attention to this. They're focused on allowing schools to have this freedom and flexibility. But I think this is where a lot of the federal policies are misguided in saying we're going to hold schools accountable for the debt that their students take on. So when you say, National Louis University, we're going to hold you accountable for a student's debt to earnings ratio. And then you say, well, your students took on more debt than they could pay, back their loan based on their earnings. It's really not fair because an institution can't control the debt a student takes on. So a more fair way to look at this would be saying, what's a tuition to earnings ratio? So National Louis University, if you've got a low tuition price point and students can earn an adequate income to pay back what you charge, it's more fair and starts to bend the cost curve and incentivize institutions to lower that price point. And those institutions like the Harvards, the Yales, and I'm okay calling them out, that charge $30,000, $40,000 a year, their graduates, quite frankly, come into them with extreme social capital. Many of their students already have social capital, so they're not borrowing. And if they are, they've got family wealth that they're going to pay that back. And so I don't care about those schools. I care about the schools serving today's students, the adult and the working learners. And those are the schools that I think, if we're looking at policy, it's addressing solutions for students pursuing degrees at American College of Education and National Louis University who are trying to keep that price point low, but need the flexibility to make sure students aren't borrowing excessive amounts and getting in debt.
So I want to, this I think mostly concludes, although we can come back to in the closing comments, our policy section. I think hopefully this piques some interest. There's some things I think I'm not sure the average person knows about policy that we just heard in the last few minutes. Jordy, I want to come to you. Mm-hmm. You have a very different model, and I want to make sure everybody here knows about it.
Great. Well, just before I get into that, quickly on the policy side, I like your suggestions because while schools can't advise on student debt, there certainly has been a huge tuition inflation, which obviously encourages students to take on more debt. So I think that point can't get lost in this discussion. Also on the policy side, there's in my mind, a misguided effort to take out a state reciprocity agreement, NC-SARA, which makes it easier for schools like us that are online to operate across states. And if that happens, I think many schools will need to have a lot more red tape and potentially raise tuition. So hopefully that can be kept in place. But just in terms of American College of Education, so we were founded 20 years ago on the idea of providing a debt-free college education. And we were founded by teachers for teachers. And the idea was to facilitate high-quality experience for adult learners that didn't bring people into debt. So at this point, we're serving about 10,000 students. We have 40,000 graduates. We're the number 3 conferrer of education, Masters of Education degrees, and the 9th largest in terms of doctoral programs in education. Our MBA, Masters, and Bachelor completed programs are less than $10,000. Our doctorate degrees are less than $24,000. And we have about an 6% graduation rate. And one of the things we're most proud of is that 85% of students come out of our programs with no debt, and they pay term by term. In addition to the commitment to not increase tuition, we haven't raised tuition in over 6 years and have no plans to do so. We have very extensive professional development content partnerships. So we have a very progressive approach to credit for prior learning. We bring in a lot of credits, and that further brings down the costs. So over the last number of years, net tuition for many of our students has decreased substantially. And one of the ways that we've been able to grow efficiently is that a large number of our students come from graduate referrals. So you may not have heard of us. We don't, at this point, do a lot of investment in marketing because there's a virtuous circle in terms of the value proposition. And really, we were founded on the focus of providing value to students. So we tried to articulate that in a financial from a financial perspective by having Lightcast conduct an ROI study, and they looked at our actual data for 2022 for our students and found that for every $1 that a student invests in our tuition, they receive $19.20 in future career earnings. So I think that's very helpful for prospective students to, it's just one data point. There's obviously a huge number of factors in terms of the quality of the education and our faculty and the student experience. But that's helpful to quantify it. And I wish more schools would quantify the student ROI, not the institutional ROI, but the student ROI. We also, on our website, we have a document called Student Right to Know, where by degree program, we list out the self-reported earnings of our students and then the increase in earnings. And in the first year, our average student across our programs gets a $21,000 salary increase. And I should mention the majority of our students we have bachelor completers, but majority are masters and doctoral students. And many of our students are in education. We're serving teachers, but we also serve nurses and healthcare workers, and we have an MBA as well.
But Jordy, you didn't touch on, I think, one of the most interesting parts of your model. You are one of the very small handful of universities in this country that doesn't participate in the Title IV federal student aid system. And I've often thought that that's why your price point is so low, because you're not chasing subsidies and you're not saying, hey, students, go borrow and get a Pell Grant and use it here. You have to keep your tuition low because students can't borrow in the traditional federal loan market. So you've got a unique model.
Yeah, so I think I'll get you an ACE Ambassador t-shirt, but I appreciate you pointing that out. But I think, so that's a big part of it. There's a lot of, obviously, processes and oversight that goes along with Title IV programs. But I think that governance is an important part as well, and just we have to, if you think about our model with not raising tuition, we have to really make sure we're providing a quality experience. It's a practitioner model. We have great faculty, superintendents are our faculty, but we can't just throw money at problems. So when we're trying to innovate, we pilot, we have a fail fast mentality, but we have to be very purposeful in terms of where we put our investments, and we have a fantastic executive team. A number of them are here today, and a very good relationship with our board in order to do that.
That's great. So I think one of the things I take away from this conversation and what you just said about your model, and Naveen, what you're talking about innovating at National Louis to move to a more stackable credentials, is that there are aspects of this that are about policy, there are aspects of this that are about how you engage with students, and there are aspects of this about how you structure what it is that you are and what you do. One other aspect, and Sarah, I'm going to come to you on this, and then I have one question for everybody to bring us home. Engaging with employers. So if we are going to have relevant credentials, the employer world is not static. How do you keep pace? How do you align with what employers need?
Yeah, I was hoping you were going to go to that question, because part of this gets back to skills, right? And skills that are employable and that employers are actively looking for, that are in demand. So everything we do starts with labor market data, and I'm sure a lot of you have either Lightcast subscriptions or some other way to access what are employers looking for, right? So we use Lightcast, we use Indeed, we use LinkedIn, we use all sorts of sources that give us the highest level viewpoint of at least the skills that are layering up to those job descriptions. And then we take that data and we align it to what are the technologies that we're also seeing inside those skill sets. So, and when I talk about technologies, I'm talking about things like Salesforce or Tableau or Atlassian Jira, right? These are technologies that employers are using today that they would love to have people who they can hire who already have developed some of these skill sets. And not just how to use the technology, but why they're using the technology, right? The contextual components around that. And so we develop relationships with those technology organizations. And then we take that and we frame it in a syllabus that we then, we do two things. So one is we pass it through, there's a platform called Winter. And for us, again, we're serving adult learners. Within that platform, we can get feedback from professionals who are in these jobs, who are saying, I'm actively hiring for these people. And so we're able to take quantitative data and qualitative data. Once we have that, we align to our syllabus, and then we go out to a pool of subject matter experts. These are people hiring for these jobs, right? They're actively saying, I need candidates that have these types of skill sets, and they're kind of our final review of what we plan to teach as part of our curriculum. And then it changes all the time, right? And so we're constantly looking at and to some degree, Lightcast can be more of a lagging sort of indicator. It doesn't give us as much data. And so actually having those connections into industry where you're developing the relationships, again, with the people hiring these jobs is so critical because they're the ones echoing back to us how the skills are changing or, you know, what their expectations of how they want people to be able to develop GPTs as they're coming into these new jobs. And so a lot of that is framed, and it's just a matter of keeping the content then really relevant to what employers are looking for, which means we're in like, monthly revs of things at times.
That's great. I think rounds out our conversation well. So I have a last question for everybody. About like 30 seconds each so we can get everybody in. Next year, when you come back, somebody in this room is going to say, hey, I saw that panel you were on last year. That was great. One thing you talked about was this. How's it going? What's the thing that you are working on? And you all work in different sorts of realms. So what's something you're working on, maybe related to this topic, that would be nice, that you want somebody to ask you about in a year, and where do you hope to be? Steve.
Well, I'll start, and I'll be brief.
We'll take volunteers, yeah.
So one of the things that we've spent a lot of time talking about in terms of the student debt is the importance of completion in this question, right? Because it is hard enough to pay back your loans with a degree. It is that much harder if you are not completing. And so with our foundation, with our operating company, we've been spending a lot of time over the last several years thinking about basic needs and trying to ensure that we partner with people to support those students that don't have the social capital, those students that are one flat tire away from dropping out, because that's really going to rise up the underserved to ensure that they can complete and then pay off their loans.
Okay, so 2025, we're going to ask Dan about the group and your work on basic needs. Yep. Okay, Sarah, you look like you're ready.
Yeah, no, mine's easy. I would say for the employers that are hiring people who complete our programs, are we meeting their needs, right? Are the candidates meeting the expectations that they've set for these individual contributor roles?
That's great. Employer feedback. Okay, who's next?
Already
did?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to. So we're trying to provide a debt-free, high-quality education, but ultimately we're trying to increase the human capital and the strength of our school districts and hospital systems. So we have a team that's working directly to provide bespoke solutions to hospitals and school districts to try to help them attract, retain, and upskill teachers and nurses. So love to be asked about that a year from now because I think we're making a big impact.
That's great. That's great.
A
I
year
think it's
from
the
now,
last word. Okay, Naveen, next to you.
a year from now, I'd like to be asked where we were in putting together the 3-year degree, which now I've been pushing the team to make it 2.5. So, because I do believe the speed to completion is really important for learners.
That's great.
I love that. Short-term Pell, right, in the headlines. For us, a year from now, ask me how we're doing in terms of expanding the use of existing federal and state dollars for students to use for non-college pathways.
That's great. You guys, so much rich discussion in 40 minutes, maybe 40 minutes and a half, although we have 24 seconds. Everybody, let's give a hand to our panel here. Thank you all. And everybody have a good conference.